Was the Arab Spring a Twitter revolution? That was something that was debated back and forth in the New Yorker and in the Atlantic Monthly and in the New York Times, sort of ad infinitum in the period right after the Arab Spring, the major events of the Arab Spring came about. And the back and forth was one of those sorts of really silly discussions in some ways. At the time, it seemed kind of important to make this case that it was a Twitter revolution, but it's really hard to make that case, and it's really hard to make the case that, well, slightly easier to make that case that Twitter had very little to do with it. Obviously, the revolution, the revolution in Egypt and the kind of the demonstrations in Tunisia and kind of across the region, all the way through, whether you want to include this in that group or not, through to Syria, it's really hard to say that those would not have happened if Twitter had not been invented. So this idea that Twitter caused it, in other words, it really was a Twitter revolution, seems on its face a little bit silly. On the other side of this, it's really hard to argue against the idea that Twitter and Facebook and some other technologies really changed the character of the Arab Spring. Now, it had been changing in lots of things along the way, but it really seemed to come into much stronger relief during that period, because you really saw how people were using Twitter in various ways to help further their cause. So I'm going to leave aside that question, right, of whether there is a Twitter revolution, there was a Twitter revolution during Arab Spring, or whether all political action now is somehow Twitter related. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Twitter and related technologies are used. So Twitter itself was created as a technology that's used to communicate within an organization. It really is, if any of you have used Slack, it really was originally designed to look much more like Slack. It was meant for people in an office to say, I'm working on X, so that everyone in the office knew that without having to walk around and tell everybody, hey, I'm working on X. So it was really a way to just kind of, and hey, does anyone want to go to lunch? That kind of thing. It was really a way to communicate with your peers, but very quickly, it became clear that it was much more interesting as a more public venue. That said, it does play an interesting role as a technology of organization. So, for one thing, it allowed people, if you want to take Tahrir Square as an example, it allowed people to kind of say, hey, I'm going there now, this is what's happening there now, this is where you should be, this is what we're trying to do. Those kinds of things could have been handled by telephone, it could have been handled by paper, it could have been handled by people actually running around and communicating this stuff. That's how these things have been handled in demonstrations in the past. But Twitter and Facebook made that much easier. If you go back, and it made it harder to censor as well. Although Egypt shut down the access to the internet from the outside world and then access to the internet at all in some ways, Twitter actually countered this by setting up relays that you could use using SMS. And they didn't want to turn off all the telephones because then nobody could have been able to talk to each other, including the police in some cases. So they had to keep those on, and so they couldn't really completely censor this process. The use of these new digital technologies, social media, the internet, for this process of organizing demonstrations, or organizing revolts, runs back pretty far. I went to the University of Washington for my PhD, and when I was there, the demonstration against the WTO, which eventually got named the Battle of Seattle, not by anyone that was there, but that's what some journalists started calling it, and so it kind of caught, was really a surprise to people. I mean, everyone knew that when the WTO came to town, that there would be people there to demonstrate against it. But everyone was pretty much surprised that you had these really diverse groups of people, all with their own issues that were kind of coordinating and working together. So you had people that were there for women's issues, people there who were there to talk about labor practices, people who were there, as part of the unions or in the places where extraction was being done for raw materials. You had people that were there from Greenpeace. You had all these people that were coming for seemingly very diverse reasons, but they all managed to show up and they all managed to demonstrate. Yes, there was violence. This was the first real public appearance of Black Bloc in a way that in the United States in a way that people really saw. But there was certainly confusion in this process too. But none of this could have happened. None of this organization could have happened if not for the social media of the time, which was email. So it goes back to that. I've studied with a colleague named Maria Garrido the use of Twitter during the G20 summit in Pittsburgh and in other places. But in that case, it was very clear that Twitter played a fairly essential role. In fact, two of the people who participated in that demonstration went back home to New York City and got arrested there for using Twitter. Why? Because they were on Twitter saying where the police presence was. So you might want to avoid these intersections because the police are really heavily there, or they're using tear gas there, or they're trying to kettle people into areas there. And so these couple of people kind of set up a little nerve center where they got in reports and then told everybody where the police were. And this apparently was a violation of local law. Kind of this informing on police was not allowed. So, it ended up being a fairly coordinated process. And part of that was kind of traditional leaders who had a great deal of experience in creating demonstrations, in making media messages, all that kind of thing. Particularly Greenpeace, and I doubt any of you really remember unfortunately, the G20 protests in Pittsburgh. But during these demonstrations, some climbers went up on a big bridge, and they were Greenpeace climbers, and they deployed this big flag. This was actually one of the major sort of media events. Everybody covered this because, it's climbers on a bridge violating police cordons and dropping huge banners. So, there were those. There were the kind of professional grassroots, which is kind of a strange combination, but professional non-governmental organization and grassroots organizers who had picked up the use of Twitter and were doing a really good job of kind of organizing people's activities, letting them know who was going to be speaking, where, when, all that sort of thing. But at the same time, there were these emergent voices, these people who just happened to be part of the demonstration, but ended up taking on leadership positions. For example, there was this graduate student who was working on her arts degree in fashion design, and she happened to be involved in the protests, and she had a good eye and she could tweet well, and suddenly she had this quick following with thousands of people following her. And after a few days, once the G20 summit was over, she kind of sent out this tweet and said, "Listen, this was just for the summit. I'm going back to my everyday tweeting, which is about fashion. So you may really not want to be following me from here on. This was just one thing I did." But there was this idea of someone being able to emerge as a leader through the medium. So as part of that study, I suggested that the use of Twitter was a little bit like the people's microphone.
This is what you do. This is what you do. Since we can't use a megaphone, repeat back what I say. We'll repeat back what you say. For everyone to hear.
It's a little bit of what Twitter does, because it gets these messages from leaders and it distributes them and it allows people to talk about them, but it kind of amplifies what would otherwise be difficult to get out as a message. As part of G20, and in fact kind of across the board, including in the Arab Spring, there's also this symbiotic relationship between traditional news outlets and Twitter and Facebook and other social media. On the one hand, these are great ways of getting the very latest tips and news. So when someone sees something, you can actually get that blip where they're reporting firsthand what they have just seen. I'm sure I'm not alone. I don't really visit Twitter that much because I'm not a big fan of it. But if I want the most current news about something going on, that's where I go, because it breaks there first. So news outlets will follow Twitter, and journalists are they have almost a professional obligation to be on Twitter so that they can keep a pulse on what's going on that way. And so they'll get tips from the social web that they can then craft into stories. This was especially important during the Arab Spring, and I would say actually even more important in the early actions in Syria, because there really wasn't a way for journalists to get in. So the way they got news out of Syria was people would throw it up on Facebook or on Twitter or on YouTube, And then the regional news outlets, Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, would pick up this news from Twitter or Facebook and republish it. So that they couldn't get journalists in to actually take original work, but they could draw from the social web and do some things to verify it, and then use that to kind of build their news story. So that's the one direction. Then the other direction is, this is the best way. Nobody sits down and watches these 5 o'clock news anymore. So if you want to get news out, journalists kind of have to rely on social media to push that. So during the protests themselves, some of the most retweeted tweets are links to actual regular old news stories that you might not have run into until days later if you're out there, protesting, but they may be of pretty immediate interest to you. So it's this back and forth. News media doesn't exist at this point without these social tentacles reaching out there and both feeding it and then distributing its outputs. I think so. Those are two kinds of ways in which Twitter has been used in demonstrations. I think that is one as a means for coordinating action, as kind of a system for management, and two as this kind of news augmentation of some sort, adding to news and also helping to build the news and also kind of providing an outlet for news to be distributed. So I think those two are really important. But I think even more important is this idea of, well, let's start with a kind of an aside, which is if I am in Germany and the Nazi Party has just started its rise to power and, I don't like Nazis, am I going to say something about it out in public? Now, there's a very good reason I wouldn't. Eventually, it became a totalitarian state, and, eventually that would have led to me being arrested if I was very critical of the Nazi Party once it had really seized all control of the country. But at the earlier stages, it was just a populist movement, right? It was, let's make Germany great the way it was before World War I. The reason that we're not doing well is because of all these foreigners and people that are outsiders who are kind of tainting the way that Germany is supposed to be. Let's bring back the fatherland. It was a very populist movement, right? And so I can imagine being in that situation and saying, hey, wait, no, we're the foreigners and the Jews and all the people that you seem to think are horrible actually have contributed to the culture as well as the economy of the state. But I might not want to say that even if I wasn't going to get arrested, because I would be thinking to myself, is that opinion weird? Like everywhere I see, there's this swastika showing up, and it seems like everybody's talking in favor of it, and maybe I'm the weird one who doesn't like the Nazis, right? And so because of that, I just decided it's probably safer for me to be quiet for a while and see how things shake out. So Noel Neumann says the problem with that is that the reason I don't know other people are like me, are thinking in the same way I do, is they've done the same calculus, right? They've gone out and seen nobody talking out, and so they assume they're alone. And because they assume they're alone, they don't talk out. And this spirals down so that they become entirely silent. The theory is called the spiral of silence. It's kind of a simplification, but that's the basic idea. So I saw this weird sort of talk thing that Julian Assange did, where he claimed somehow that the WikiLeaks leak of the American cables led somewhat directly to the Arab Spring. Now, to me, that's a leap. It's still a leap. His claim was that, you finally, the transparency of seeing what America did let people really kind of feel like an American supported regime in Egypt may not be something that is something we really want, or something like that. You can go out and find the interview with Assange about why he thought this was true. But there's this one little section where he says that, the one thing that, he didn't think that Twitter and Facebook did a huge amount, but the one thing they did do is they let people in Egypt in particular, Tunisia to a certain extent, but in Egypt in particular, they let people know that they were not alone. Right? It wasn't just come out to Tahrir Square because we're there, but it was a matter of, I'm not the only one who thinks this. There's actually a bunch of my compatriots. There's a bunch of these other Egyptians around me who feel the same way. They don't talk about it at a cafe necessarily, but they feel like the current government is not representative and that it needs to go, and yada, yada, yada. And more than that, they also, a lot of the critiques around the use of social media in social protest is that it is, quote unquote, clicktivism, right? That it encourages people to feel like they're doing something good by putting a French flag over their picture, or in this case, tinting their picture green to show support of the Iranians, or, for example, there's a whole range of kinds of, you've seen them now on Facebook. It's almost a cliche that people are changing the frame of their picture in order to support something every day. And so for some people, that's the worst, absolutely worst kind of online activism, because it's meaningless. It is clicktivism. It requires no work for you, and it probably doesn't do anything for them. Well, one of the things that it might do is actually make visible this international support. And in interviewing people afterwards that were pretty instrumental in the Egyptian protests, helping to organize them and taking a leadership role in them, they said that, even if there wasn't actual material or logistical support from outside the country, the idea that the world was watching and was paying attention to them and was supporting them was kind of a psychic and social boost for them. They felt like again, not only are there fellow Egyptians who feel the way I do, but the world as a whole is kind of on our side. Now, they aren't doing much about it, but at least they know what's going on, and they have given us some kind of moral purchase by saying that it's not just the people who are out there on the street, but it's a large portion of the world who's supporting the people out on the street. So I think you can walk the line. I think you can overstate how much influence clicktivism might have, but I do think it's a really important first step to creating political change. And, I might describe this as something a little bit like a reverse spiral of silence. You see someone on Twitter saying something, you retweet it, you maybe add your own thoughts about it, and suddenly people are starting to see, hey, there's people who think like I do. There's people who have ideas similar to mine. I can add my voice to that. And so you have this kind of little thing with a few people talking about it that quickly balloons into, a whole movement, a whole group of people who are reinforcing each other's ideas. So I think that's the most important, frankly, use of social media in social movement. That is, it's not necessarily, the coordination piece is great. I think, for example, the SOPA protests showed a really good use of not necessarily Twitter, but other media for doing very widespread, very rapid, very careful, very surgical use of media to kind of really push something forward. But I think the bigger use is this idea of a kind of the shadow, right? Of this silent majority that isn't silent anymore. This group that stands aside, this virtual army that's standing behind you when you're actually putting your body on the line out on the street. So I think that this idea of a reverse spiral of silence, what would you call that? Not a reverse spiral of silence, a climbing helix of cacophony. That's horrible. So I won't call it that. We'll just call it a reverse spiral of silence. But I think that is the piece that is the most important. Now, overall, I think there's this kind of perfect combination between bubbles, and we'll talk about filter bubbles at some point, but this idea that you can surround yourself with people who only think like you do, and they reject anybody who doesn't. I mean, some of that's pretty explicit. I can go on Facebook and join the biggest pro 2020 Trump election site, and I can say, hey, I can join that group, which is a very large group, and you will not find anyone who is anti-Trump in that group, right? The ideas that they present, this kind of fairly, I would say, adulation of the president, all of this is heavily self-supported. Now, in that case, it's pretty extreme, because if you say anything that's either anti-Trump or quote-unquote liberal, they'll boot you, right? You'll get banned. Not all groups are that way, but to a certain extent, many are. I've seen this now in lots of different groups, this willingness to call on a moderator and say, just let's boot this person. Their ideas are too far outside of the circle that we find acceptable. So those bubbles are something to be concerned about, but they're also a form of community support, that you don't have to be alone in your ideas anymore. And I think that when we think about bubbles, we think of them as kind of a protective space, but I think of them also as kind of bubbling up, right? They allow the space where you can kind of accumulate ideas and people, and those can start to effervesce, can start to become more widespread and more visible. And sooner or later you start to have some real significant change starting from these little bubbles of people that are sharing their ideas and finding common ground. And so more broadly, I think that piece is where social media is really important for social movements, is that temporary space in which they can have some cohesion, and then at the same time use the same sets of media to distribute that idea more broadly.